Hello, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Atlantic Studies, and today we're kicking off our spring series with an open house discussion with the wonderful Jacqueline Vayntrub. Jackie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. So, Jackie, today we're being joined by some members of our community, and we're going to be discussing something we haven't talked about before. We are going to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. But then in association with that, we're going to talk about a theme we have talked a lot about and thought a lot about, which is sort of the quest and the desire for immortality. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we really begin our discussion, I'd like to just share a little bit about your work with our community. So Jackie, you are currently a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. You are a philologist who has studied the formation of the Hebrew Bible, its various genres and modes of discourse, against a broader background of ancient Near Eastern literary production. You're also interested in the reception and impact on Western scholarship. And also, I want to let everyone know that your first book, The Limits of Biblical Poetry, is currently in preparation, and that is exploring how the theories of poetry from classical times to the present have shaped the scholarly approaches to biblical poetry. So that's just a very, very brief introduction. We're going to share a link to your wider bibliography on our website so people can learn more after our talk. So we're just so grateful you're joining us today, and our community members will introduce themselves when they ask questions. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to you so that you can sort of introduce us to the Epic of Gilgamesh, just get us started thinking.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. This is so much fun. I want to begin, I'm actually trying to move my cursor over here to move something and I've lost it.
No problem, don't worry about
it. 1 second while I find the lost cursor.
Yes, that's okay. So
here we go.
Oh, good.
Found it, found the lost cursor.
Great.
I'd like to begin with a few words that I've jotted down just to get us thinking and get us going. The Epic of Gilgamesh is an irreducibly rich tale with still many relevant themes. It's a long ancient history of its shaping and reshaping, and a no less exciting modern history of the story's rediscovery after 18 centuries of being literally buried in the ground. I can recommend some further reading on these two topics, and hopefully we could maybe post some of that bibliography afterwards. On the ancient history of the text and the modern history of its rediscovery. But if I talk about all those things, we won't have time to really get the discussion going. So instead, I want to talk about what this tale is about, why I think this tale is important for us to read, and why it's still relevant to modern readers, and the passage I've selected for us to focus on. So to start with, why does this tale live on? The Gilgamesh story, in the version we've come to know, is a thrilling, beautiful, and also disturbing tale. It's thrilling for its tales of adventure and the imagination of a world beyond the human realm, beyond civilization. For example, the description of the garden Gilgamesh reaches after racing against the clock through the tunnel of darkness is, for me, nearly cinematic, where he encounters trees whose fruit are gemstones. I imagine Alice in Wonderland or Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. The ocean the Gilgamesh crosses to reach Utnapishtim, where the waters are deadly, remind me of a scene out of Harry Potter. So the Epic of Gilgamesh for me is sort of the original fantasy and adventure tale. It's beautiful for its touching descriptions of the universal human experiences of love and loss. The adventures Gilgamesh embarks upon seem at times to be actually just a backdrop for the main event, the deep friendship between Gilgamesh and his partner in crime, Enkidu, a match literally made in heaven. And the immenseness of their friendship, deepened by their extraordinary experiences together, make the end of this friendship, Enkidu's death, all the more tragic, all the more monumental. We cannot help but think of perhaps our own experiences with love, and it's always inevitable loss in one form or another. So the story generates empathy and recognition of the likeness of all our life experiences to this nearly 4,000-year-old tale. And for that reason, the tale is disturbing. It draws us in, and it forces us to confront, unadorned, the ambivalence of our human condition. So Gilgamesh, as a character, his own devil-may-care disposition, his arrogance and need for fame and adventure, brings about the need, existence, and ultimately the death of his dear friend Enkidu. Gilgamesh is capable of love, but he is also capable of horrible things, and that's something that I think may be overlooked. Even his intense mourning over the loss of his friend Enkidu is redirected towards anxiety over his own life, his own mortality, and serves to fulfill his own desire to resolve that anxiety. So the story might teach us, disturbingly, that even monsters can love. Even Huwawa of the cedar forest begs for mercy. Does he mean it? Or that, even more disturbingly maybe, that our capacity for love does not necessarily make us any less monstrous, any less capable of horrific deeds. So Gilgamesh starts out a tyrant, and despite his friendship to Enkidu all along the way, Gilgamesh's actions seem to bring Enkidu ever closer to his demise. So he initially protests entering the cedar forest to confront Huwawa, but Gilgamesh eggs him on, wants the adventure. Huwawa curses Enkidu, foretelling his death. Gilgamesh then, fresh from killing Huwawa, cleans up all nice, manages to attract the goddess Ishtar, spurns her advances, and then bringing on again what turns out to be a threat to Enkidu's life when Ishtar complains to her father, Anu, brings about the Bull of Heaven. So again, Gilgamesh ropes in Enkidu. They battle the Bull of Heaven together, kill him off, and when the gods are outraged and determined that one of the two should die for this sin, it's decided that Enkidu, not Gilgamesh, goes. And although it seems like Gilgamesh might be bringing about Enkidu's demise, Enkidu at every step is a steadfast and loyal friend. At the end of Enkidu's life, when all hope is lost, he curses the hunter who found him, the tavern woman who civilized him, but never Gilgamesh. Ultimately, though, I find the tale disturbing because in following Gilgamesh through good times and bad, we as readers come to identify with him and hope for his success. So it's disturbing because we may see ourselves in him, a person who's capable of such extraordinary achievement and even extraordinary love, who cannot conquer the monstrosity of his mortal anxiety, who cannot overcome his interest in pure and simple self-promotion and self-preservation. So that is, from my own view, why I think the story is still relevant, why it's still read. And so that ties into specifically what I hope we'll talk about today, which is the way Gilgamesh approaches death, the nature of his mortal anxiety, and how, if at all, this mortal anxiety is resolved in the story. So I will actually ask one of our Hollywood squares, maybe you could put a hand up and say you're willing to read this passage. And it's the passage where Enkidu's already died, and Gilgamesh has already gone off on his journey to seek immortality, and he encounters Siduri, the divine tavern keeper, and they have an exchange. So I wonder if someone would want to read. It's on the text that we're reading on page 17. And Gilgamesh, it begins, Gilgamesh answered her, and why should not my cheeks be starved and my face drawn? And then she answers. So.
Okay, does anyone have that handy? Oh, Maria, thank you. Oh, Maria, but you're muted. Oh, Maria, can you unmute your microphone? Oh, I think Maria might be having some trouble. Maybe we should choose a different reader for right now. Sarah,
yeah.
Do you have that available? Oh, Maria has it. Okay.
Okay. I'm afraid. Is it page 17? You said?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And which part exactly?
So Gilgamesh answered her, and why should not my cheeks be starved and my face drawn? And then the paragraph after that as well.
Said to Siduri, the young woman, how can I be silent? How can I rest?
Oh, hold on. I think we want two paragraphs above that.
Yeah.
Okay. Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying to? You will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things. Day and night, night and day, Dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water, cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. Shall I continue?
No, that's perfect. And so that's what Siduri answers to Gilgamesh when he comes over and says, why should I not be so upset? My best friend died. I'm completely inconsolable. And so I would pose to all of us and anyone who wants to start talking about this, what is Gilgamesh after? Why does he need this immortality so badly? And what is Siduri's response?
These are beautiful questions. Let's see. Does anyone have a thought? Anyone feel ready to start? People are feeling a little bit shy.
Mm-hmm. So I was. This is Sarah from Scotland. So I was just thinking, perhaps taking a very slight step back, because we've been more familiar with the ancient Greek heroes. And so I was immediately thinking about Achilles and Patroclus, and his having to really confront that choice between the two paths. And I wondered whether there might be parallels here, but I don't quite see a parallel here with Siduri's answer. With the closest parallel I can think of is Thetis saying, well, you've got these two choices, and you can have, a long life back home and no glory, or you can have a short, glorious life, but you will die young. And here, there seems to be, well, feast and rejoice and be happy. And that seems to be a choice that Achilles just didn't have. So I don't know that I've got any answers, but that was what immediately struck me as the difference here between those two heroes.
Beautiful, and there's it's so rich. So I can actually pitch this one book that came out 10 years ago by Susan Ackerman, who's a scholar of ancient Near Eastern literature and culture. When Heroes Love, and this book is about comparing the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu and the biblical friendship between David and Jonathan. But then we have here also from the classical world Achilles and Patroclus, and we can talk about even so that's a really interesting thing that we can talk more about. And another thing that another direction we can go, not just talking about the friendship, is we can talk about Siduri and her response, and perhaps we can compare it to the response to Calypso and Odysseus. So this is the most recent work on Gilgamesh scholarship by a Assyriologist, Tzvi Abush. And in there he has an essay on Siduri and Gilgamesh, this exchange, and how in the Old Babylonian version of the epic, what we're reading is the standard Babylonian version. In the Old Babylonian version of the epic, there is no search for Nepishtim. That in fact Siduri, Gilgamesh is looking to Siduri, and this is what he suggests, to make a life with her, to marry her and find perhaps immortality through that union. And if you read her response like that to that kind of proposal, she's saying, well, no, you don't want this. What you need is something more normative, right?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that in another variant, there's an option where I want to say Beowulf, where Gilgamesh is trying to say, listen, if we connect, then this is another shot for immortality, right?
Yeah. So
just like in Odysseus and Calypso. I just want to make it super clear for some of our viewers who may not. Yes.
Yes.
Great. That's so
and so I think something that we can think about is how is Siduri responding to Gilgamesh, who says, I need to find immortality to resolve this anxiety that was brought about by the loss of my friend. That already is something we can talk about because I think that's strange. That's something, why necessarily if someone who's very close to us dies, instead of wanting to bring them back, which, I mean, he does, right? But instead of doggedly searching for a way to bring back that relationship, one is searching for immortal life. That's strange.
Right. And instead of saying, and you do get a sense of this because he becomes so physically distressed, right? You do get a sense of, the typical response when a loved one dies is you pour ashes on yourself, right? You pour dirt on yourself. I'm going to be dead too, right? But this is sort of, but then, well, no, I just want to be immortal, which is something totally different, right? Something totally outside of the realm of human possibility. It's not. Achilles doesn't even say something like that, right? When his friend dies.
Right. So the question is, well, I think this leads us to ask a question about who Gilgamesh is as a character, right? Like we read and I know that this is something that Greg talks about in his heroes course. That the ancient Greek idea of a hero is not really what we would call a hero. Like, those two don't necessarily intersect, right?
Right.
Maybe Gilgamesh isn't someone that we want to emulate, but what are the characteristics of Gilgamesh? Who is this character?
Right. Well, it's interesting, Tim. You had written something in the sidebar actually, just as Jackie was talking. Can you talk a little bit about the connection that you saw?
Okay. I went and bought a translation by N.K. Sanders. It's fairly old, I think about 50 years. In the notes at the beginning, she talks about Siduri, who I thought was a strange character. I was surprised that we meet this woman and she's behind alcohol, basically, and I'm going, well, that's a bit weird. Why is she here? What I was surprised about was Sanders says Siduri is like Circe and says it's another daughter of the sun, and then makes the claim that Circe and her son Comus, who I don't know, dispenses the same philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry. And I just wanted to throw that out to the group. I was going quite surprised. I didn't have time to look and see where is this with Circe. I didn't remember it in, the Odyssey, this philosophy. Was I asleep or is it another story?
I don't know where it is. I'm not an expert on that material, and I would turn to any of you to find that. But there are two things that what Siduri is saying touch on. One is this philosophy of balance, right? Or not looking for something that is superhuman, and not even looking to not an intense focus on the future or the past, but on the present enjoyment, right? Or dwelling in the present, and what the present can bring, or being. I'm trying to remember where in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is, I think it's by Utnapishtim, who upbraids him for neglecting his kingly duties. He is selected to be a king. He's a king. He has responsibilities. He also has great gifts, and he's thrown those all by the wayside, including beauty, which he's completely, tossed aside for this dogged search for immortality. And so Utnapishtim criticizes him for this, and also Siduri is also saying something like, live with what you have, be happy with what you have. So that's one philosophy, but there's something else in there that I want to draw out, and I was hoping that we could draw, and we could talk about that also, but what I wanted us to draw out was where Siduri says, not only let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water, cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. And it's about perhaps a kind of immortality that any human can reach for, which is sonship, or having a child, right? Having someone who can continue one's name. That is something within the reach of mortals. So I think there's two parts to what Siduri is saying.
Right. I mean, that's so fascinating, because when we think about ancient Greek epic, we think about that relationship, especially between father and son, as so crucial to the transfer of fame, right? Which is this other means of a kind of immortality. And so it's sort of pointing towards that. So we actually have a lot that we could talk about here, because number one, I see Sarah has posted a connection to the Circe passage, and also I just want to point out, Tim, earlier in your passage, in your note in the sidebar, you were talking about the extreme nature of these heroes, and I think you already had been prompting us, Jackie, to be thinking about that, right, in several ways, both with your questions and also with your introduction, talking about the monstrosity of human anxiety. I love that phrase. So I think this extreme nature of Gilgamesh is super fascinating for us, because we've seen that as a trait of ancient Greek heroes, right, guys? Which is that they are extreme both in positive and negative ways. So I'm curious to see. Yeah, sorry, Jackie, did you have a...
So in the standard Babylonian version, which is, I mean, I think that what we've been reading is kind of the prose version of the standard Babylonian version, has two prologues, right? It has a prologue that belonged to an earlier version, which is what the story was known by its incipit, by its first words, surpassing all kings. That Gilgamesh surpasses all kings, right? Monumental character, right? Larger than life. And then this, the standard Babylonian story version has another prologue that's added before that, which begins, the one who saw the deep. So we have here two different views of who Gilgamesh is, right? In an earlier version, right? Just larger than life, superhuman character who has great capacity, immense capacity. And that is juxtaposed with this now newer prologue, which is he is maybe made weary by all of his experiences. He's seen all the mysteries. He knows all of the mysteries now. He knows even the location of the one human who attained immortality, which, you know, is supposed to be, Utnapishtim is supposed to be in the middle of nowhere, no one can find him. He's even gone there and seen that. So, so these two things at odds with each other. Maybe we could talk more about what kind of hero is Gilgamesh?
Yeah. I see a hand.
Hi, I'm Jen from New York. In the beginning of Gilgamesh, we see this beautiful, strong, as you said, godly king, and then we hear about the people of Uruk. They are not happy. Yes, they have this king, but they are not happy. And in a way, Gilgamesh is so alone, and he is acting out, perhaps. And they pray for a companion for him, or someone to get rid of him. And people of Uruk are in the focus in the beginning, and then they disappear, and we all only focus on the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Can you talk about a little bit how Enkidu becomes human?
So that is, I mean, I think that's so fascinating. And anyone, feel free to jump in at any time, because, you know, I get tired of hearing my own voice. But it's so interesting. Well, okay, so first of all, one of the things that you brought up, which is a really interesting part of the story, is how Gilgamesh is a hero, but he's a tyrant. He has these horrible qualities and doing horrible things with his great superhuman capacity. And so then there's this companion that's created for him, right? Coming out of the wild and civilized civilized through engagement with a prostitute, right? A prostitute is civilizing him. And if I were to start to wildly speculate on the kind of symbolism that that this has for the story, is that maybe we're seeing here a philosophy of how humans become civilized. That there is in a person a very primal sexual urge, and that is the primary thing that relates us to another person. And everything else that is social is drawn out of that. And I'm not saying, I'm not being deterministic and saying like that's how it is, but maybe that is what the story is trying to draw out, an idea of how people are socialized, that our basic connection to another is this sexual desire, and that anything social can be built off of that or on analogy to that, right? Mm. Than eating and drinking.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting as we think about that kind of civilization is the process that takes place when someone is coming out of the grieving, sort of coming out from grieving, right? Because that involves sort of staying away from sex, staying away from food, and then returning to those things as part of sort of returning to their life within ancient Greek stone culture, at least. Yeah. So I see some comments in the sidebar. Would anyone like to share some of those now with the group? Helen, maybe? Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, I like this, what Tim wrote. I think the hubris we see with Enkidu and Gilgamesh, who is the most glorious of heroes, who is the most eminent of men, and Enkidu throwing the bullthigh at Ishtar brings judgment down as well as so Tim's pointing out something really interesting, which is at the end of their adventures, it's like how Gilgamesh, how Enkidu takes up qualities of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh takes up qualities of Enkidu, that they become intertwined like that, mimicking each other. And I'm trying to remember who said, Janet, right before we started going on air, you were talking about how you thought it was so interesting how after Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh makes himself look like Enkidu. He makes himself look wild. Maybe that's something we can talk about, how the story is representing friendship and love.
Yeah, these are amazing. These are amazing themes, right? So I think that makes me think of a quote that I had seen in the first tablet, actually, and I think Enkidu is about to speak to the harlot, and in my translation, which is Kovacs, it says, becoming aware of himself, he sought a friend, and that just seems so like what a moving statement, right? About that kind of intertwining of what's going to happen between these two individuals. That his kind of own sense of identity is totally sort of wrapped up in that other individual too.
Well, I mean, it might be like there's lots look, the story's irreducibly rich, but there are lots of perspectives that we could look at the story. Yeah. One perspective, we could look at it as how maybe the inability of us to ever really have any true relationship with an other without just grafting our own desires and self-image onto that other. Mm-hmm. That this story might be a sustained meditation on the inability for there to be actual true interaction between two people, or the complexity of relationships between two people. Because recognizing himself, right, he sought a friend. Yes. At the end, Gilgamesh is, he mourns for so long in fact, that the mourning never ends, right? One of the reasons why we have rituals of mourning is to direct all of that pain and emotion and anxiety to a certain set of rituals and period of time so that it may end, so that it has an end. But he doesn't have, Gilgamesh doesn't participate in those rituals in the normal circumscribed fashion. So it goes on forever. It's endless, and it leads him to these to an adventure to a journey that is distracting, at least in the view of Siduri, right? And in the view of Utnapishtim, both of them telling him like, hey, you have other things that you need to be doing.
Can you guide us a little bit more? I'd like to return to that journey and really to the place where you started us with, which is Gilgamesh saying about why he looks so bad, because he's been on this journey, and he has spent 7 days and 7 nights sort of mourning for his friend. But can you talk a little bit more about that journey and how he gets there? I'm curious about the leagues of darkness that he goes through. What is your take on that?
Okay, so there's an understanding of the path on which the sun moves on a track, and in order to get there, he has to get to these 2 mountains that are the opening to this. These 2 high peaks, which reach the underworld and also go up to the top of the heavens and are the opening to these 12 leagues of darkness through which the sun enters and goes on this track. So he has 12 hours to get there, right?
Okay. Fascinating. So each league is an hour.
Yeah,
beautiful. Well, we love that because we think about hours in our project. I love it. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. He has 12 hours to get there before the sun gets in. It's like a train.
Of course, brilliant. Yes.
So he's running. So he has to run. You have 12 hours. This is the Scorpion couple that says, you have 12 hours. Good luck. So he runs, and he's running, and finally he gets, and you can imagine, the way it's described, that it gets darker and darker and darker and darker, which is horrifying, right? I mean, there's nothing more horrifying than running in pitch black darkness. So, I mean, surely, one quality that Gilgamesh has throughout is immense courage, and lack of fear, and yet the fear that we must overcome to live our lives well, he cannot overcome, right? So he has immense courage for all of these crazy superhuman things that no one would try to go on the track of the sun and beat it.
Yes. So, I mean, I think what's so amazing about that is just what you're saying. I mean, he's steadfast in the face of all these terrors, and yet what he says is, my friend has died, now I'm afraid of death.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and there's no escaping it, because that's just the human condition.
So I'd be interested if there's anyone in the discussion who wants to talk about comparing Gilgamesh to Achilles. I see a hand up.
That's Jack.
Jack.
Oh, so you're still muted, Jack. Thanks.
Sorry. The blind cursor. Yes, it seems to me that there's so many parallels of Gilgamesh and Achilles in the story, the storylines of the epics, going from being a superhuman, super strong, powerful hero, let's say hero, to being very humanized. One thing that struck me, I read this in Pritchard's The Ancient Near East, where he leaves out tablet 12, saying it's just an inorganic appendage, where Gilgamesh meets Enkidu and is grieving and asks Enkidu questions, as in a Naquiya, where the survivor, a surviving hero, asks dead heroes. We compare the Odyssey and Book 11. For that, it seems to be a standard feature of ancient epic, and compare Achilles being visited by Patroclus between line 60 and 100 odd of book 23 of the Iliad. There's some differences. Achilles reaches out for Patroclus, whereas Gilgamesh and Enkidu embrace. But there is a role reversal of the superiority. The after death, the therapone, or the inferior character, in fact, after death has the upper hand, and it's the survivor who is in grief and confusion and asking these why questions, and how, and what is the nature of this world, or this universe.
That's beautiful. Jackie, can you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and something that I had not made it's a wonderful connection that I had not made myself, that leads me to think now, so knowledge, of course, trumps any kind of social hierarchy, right? Someone who has superior knowledge then is, in a sense, above, or higher than, more superior than a person who has less. And so, of course, what happens after death is a mystery, right? And this is actually, it's interesting, because I think if any one of my colleagues, I would say, what's going on in tablet 12? They would say, well, it doesn't really belong, doesn't really make sense in the story. But maybe we're also missing an understanding of how narrative, in these kinds of narratives, are supposed to work, right? Maybe we're missing something there. And this parallel that you brought up is really interesting. So there, and I want to look at the version that we have here, because the version we have doesn't give any sort of like which tablet is which. It's putting it all together, and
would you like to maybe look at another passage?
Yeah. Let me see here what.
Sure. Why don't you take?
Okay. I want to change gears a little bit,
okay.
If that's okay. I want us to go to the very beginning of the version that we have, and I want us to look at how it begins here in this version. I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. This was the man to whom all things were known. This was the man. This was the king who knew the countries of the world. He was wise. He saw mysteries and knew secret things. He brought us a tale of the days before the flood. So this prologue actually is after the fact, right? It's after the fact of the story having taken place, because he only learned about the details of the stories, the story of the flood, because of his journey to Napishtim, who could tell him this. He went on a long journey. He was weary, worn out with labor. Returning, he rested. He engraved on a stone the whole story. So this might seem sort of just pragmatically how we begin a story, but I think it's interesting that we begin with this story. The story ends, if we subtract tablet 12. The story ends with the fact that, if you guys remember, he sees, he looks over Uruk, the city. He's like, it's so funny because everything that he does, it's all the things that he does, all the things that he's trying to get. His one consolation to himself is, well, I built a great wall. Well, forget everything else. Okay, I didn't find immortality. I have a great wall. And the story ends with, in a seemingly strange way, right? If we subtract Tablet 12, it ends with him overlooking the wall and the different things in civilization. And I think that's another dimension of the story that we haven't touched on yet, which is, how does it begin and how does it end? And why does it end like this?
Okay, that's a beautiful question. So I'm hoping some of our community members will join us here in this discussion. Anyone have a thought about that, about the beginning, the beautiful opening, where we're considering the walls, being invited to walk around the walls? Yep. Jack.
I think that it's in a way an ition. The wall is something that endured, that readers or listeners, someone around in the circle listening to it, could relate the story to something that was still around. And it's as if this story is explaining how something that's a feature of the current day landscape is how it came about. There was once this great hero, and he was very arrogant, but he was very strong. And this is his story, how he came to know everything and be a wise person and leave us with this legacy of a wall that protects us from enemies.
That's something that I hadn't considered. That, of course, these great ramparts, these walls, would be there for anyone. As a kind of a remnant of a life, right? It's a thing that lasts longer than a person's lifetime, can be a testament to a person's life after they're gone. So also like a little piece of, I guess, immortality, if you will. Maybe for him, his immortality that he could seek then is this wall, right? Or this great city. Yes, Tim.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just jump into the subject. I guess it's a message to other leaders. If you want to be remembered, do something for your people instead of searching for immortality. Be useful, and that way, with your good deeds, you will be remembered.
It's almost
perhaps
that almost turns Gilgamesh into a cautionary tale of trying to have too much hubris and trying to find something that's beyond what your responsibilities are. So your responsibility and your gift, in fact, is to be king and to do something for your people, which is what Utnapishtim urges him to do, go back. And then if it's framed in this way, the whole story, it becomes almost like, Gilgamesh is a hero, but look what this hero, what he did to himself. He missed his opportunity. Well, he solved it in the end.
Beautiful. And I just think about that Achaean wall, right? Which is, we have such a different scenario there with the Achaean wall, which is that we get that preview of it being destroyed within the epic itself, which is that the walls of those cities, they're not going to be there. You can't count on those. And Achilles is going to be the one to sack the city anyway, so he's going to have to do something else.
It's these interesting themes that come up, not just in Gilgamesh and the Homeric material, but also in Ugaritic narrative tales that this is stuff that I work on, but this idea of the intersection of memory and mortality, and also storytelling. So there's an even more removed way that we can look at this whole thing as Gilgamesh, in a sense, has achieved immortality in the fact that even today we know his name, right? That he wanted his name to be great, and lo and behold, in the telling of the story, his name is remembered. And I think that that's an added dimension, especially why it's included here. He engraved on a stone.
And Tim was making a point. Yeah. Tim was making a point sort of about that, right? In the chat bar. Tim, do you want to just make that connection?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, hopefully my connection's good. Yeah, it's interesting because in the beginning they say go and look at it. It's this beautiful thing. It shines. It's got no equal. It's ancient. It's I agree with everyone that that's how he's attaining his immortality, and it's interesting to compare that with how Achilles gets his immortality, that he's interested in being remembered through his song culture. And I'd just like to throw out here that I'm wondering, are we dealing with a song culture with the story of Gilgamesh? It feels like it's an oral performance. It feels like we've got the performer at the beginning, doing very similar things to the beginning of the Odyssey and the Iliad, giving us, here's the key points that I want you to understand, and now we'll get into the story. I wonder, how does the group feel about that?
So, I'm having a little, there's a kind of echo.
For a brief second I had an echo. It's gone now. Does anyone else still hear it?
Nope.
I think it's okay. Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
Great. So the tradition that we are reading, right, the version that we're reading, had gone through many different versions in a scribal tradition. Changes that happened on the level of actual writing and script. And the whole story has many different versions and different periods, and our earliest written versions go back to 5 Sumerian poems in the 3rd millennium BC. That's the earliest that we have, but not in this form, right? And not with this narrative arc, right? Which is far more recent than those. But of course, these written and oral texts exist at the same time, right? And there's a whole literary tradition in the background that is drawing from, and of course, it's for us, this translation is in prose, right? Which makes it easier. It gives us access, but it sacrifices some of the aesthetic of it's poetry, right? So yeah, there is an oral background. But I think that by the time we get to the Standard Babylonian version, it's been so much a part of the scribal curriculum for so long that I don't think that we can talk exactly about the way people would be, scribes copying it and reading it and reshaping it, would necessarily think about it in performative terms. So I think that probably addresses that. But at the same time, it's this is a literary culture that has, a huge oral tradition that we can't access, right?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I get the impression from the repetition that goes on that it seems to be a signature of oral performance, that we're seeing it start that way and then it gets written down, and I almost wonder, is that when it starts to become very static, or are they starting to bring in other stories and put them together? You mentioned that early on there are only, I think, 5 stories. We seem to have a lot of different stories in this final version, and things that are confusing, like this character Humbaba feels to me not like a forest troll, but probably a god of another people. You're off, you're raiding, you're getting cedar, you're probably taking your Gilgamesh with you to go and beat up the other guy's gods or something. And then there's this funny thing about the mountain lions. You know, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he beats up mountain lions. And I'm going, is that another story that we haven't got everything?
Yeah, and we haven't got everything, obviously. We don't have access to everything. And people who would have been very familiar with this, I mean, likely even, you know, the most educated scribes probably had like a huge amount of these stories by memorized, maybe from text, but maybe not, maybe memorized as or known as oral traditions. And we just don't know that. But I think you're right in the sense that repetition is a feature. It's something that shows up a lot in oral traditions. But it's also something that could be a part of a literary tradition that values performance, even though its texts are written. So it values the aesthetic of the performed aesthetic and can use it to get across certain ideas. So you could repeat something many times in the mouths of different characters or in the same character in dialogue with other characters in order to highlight the difference, right? So Gilgamesh, for example, saying the same thing over and over again in his encounters with different characters, then it highlights the difference of their response, right? So what Gilgamesh says recedes into the background, and then we see the importance of the different responses from the different characters. So it may point to, you know, a kind of performed aesthetic, but it also does something in the written text for the reader.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, that's okay. So, you know, unfortunately, Jackie has just lost her connection. That's okay. She's going to come right back. Guys, can we continue while she reconnects? Can we just continue talking a bit about this idea of performance at the beginning, sort of the embeddedness of this performance? Hey, Jackie, how are you? Sorry about that. I'm sorry, we had difficult connection. So we were just trying to think some more about performance and performed speech within a literary text. And, you know, I see we have about 7 minutes left. I'm wondering if, you know, maybe if people still have questions, we can continue talking about that. I was also curious to see if you might talk a little bit about another area of your research, which is sort of right along those lines, but in biblical Hebrew, right? You're thinking about those topics.
Yeah, so, well, the biblical materials are much more recent, and it's kind of a funny story of scholarship of how these two areas come together in comparative research. But in my work, I look at the way poems and also wisdom instructions, sort of like the Hesiodic material, are staged in texts. And biblical scholarship for a really long time thought that, I guess, it was working under a kind of understanding that poetry is, you know, it's written, but not with like less attention to performed aesthetic, right? Mm-hmm. Even though it's written, that there is a performed aesthetic. So I look at those kinds of things in staging and how a narrative will set the stage for something that's not narrative, right? A lament is not narrative, right? It's not set up in time. An instruction is not narrative. A paean is not narrative. And so, you know, a prophetic speech isn't narrative. And so how these things make their way onto text, it's kind of funny, because the medium of text is kind of strange. Its strangeness has been sort of lost on us because we're so textually minded.
Does anyone have a response to that, or anything else we've been discussing so far about this staging or this framing technique, either within Gilgamesh generally, or some of the other texts that we've been reading together as a community?
Have you guys read, I'm just curious, I know that you guys do a lot of the stuff in the Homeric material. Do you guys read Hesiod or Pindar together?
We do, yes.
Oh, I see
Maria
a
has her hand
hand
up
up.
too. Yep. Great.
Maria? I see Maria has her hand
Yeah,
up.
she's still muted though. She's going to unmute. Yep.
Okay. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Jacqueline for all the things that she presented to us. What I find very exciting in her research is what she tries to do with Hesiod and the biblical text. So what? Well, I'm also interested in those matters. Unfortunately, I don't know Hebrew. I read the biblical text through the Septuaginta. So I don't know whether this is the right approach, but since I don't know Hebrew, this is my only way to approach this text. But I would like to kindly ask Jacqueline to if it is possible for her to give us some elements that really connect Hesiod with the biblical text, because to provide you the frame of my question, this teaching block I taught my students archaic Greece in general. What I realized is that Greeks during archaic era were fascinated about lawgivers. And lawgivers were all around Greek mainland, mostly. Like Lycurgus was in Sparta. We have Draco. We have Gortin's laws. We have Solon, Cleisthenes, then later Ephialtes. But in general, during archaic era, what I would like to ask Jacqueline, does she have any elements that connect this law-giving that, of course, the Jewish people knew all along? Is this this type of lawgiver connected with the Greeks, especially during archaic era? Does she have any indications about that? Is this a trend that was transmitted from Mesopotamia or from Jewish people to Greece?
Okay. I want to make sure that Jack has a chance to respond. That's such a beautiful question.
Well, I just saw Jack's little note on the side, Hammurabi, which is great because so instead of talking about any kind of like genetic relationship between these types of speech, what I think is really interesting, what I see in Hesiod, and what I also see in the biblical and ancient Near Eastern textual staging of instructions and wisdom and even law, is that it's given as a speech by a speaker and framed in a narrative that's not just a narrative of performance, but often a narrative of transmission. So Hesiod gets it from the Muses, right? There's something that authorizes this as not just the blah 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 of someone, and so what's really great about bringing in Hammurabi, Jack, is that a lot of people have read Hammurabi as law, and maybe more specifically as case law, but they're forgetting the framing around the whole thing, which is that this is in the context of great things that Hammurabi has done, right? How great he is, and how he should be remembered, and I think it's ultimately, I'm interested in the medium of text. It's ultimately interesting for me because it's about Hammurabi's voice being memorialized inside that text as a speaker. And so that's what's really interesting to me, that Hesiod's voice of speaking things, right? And I know Greg has a whole thing about he sees name and the voice. But that the medium of text itself as something that contains the voice. That Hammurabi's stela is tall enough to be like a very tall person, containing his voice in the first person. And the same thing with these instructions. That's just a little piece of the kinds of.
That's beautiful. And you know, I think just bringing this sort of back to Gilgamesh, it's so interesting that we hear about the death of Gilgamesh. We also hear about the erection of a stele, right?
Yeah, right.
We do have those framing techniques
right.
that you so beautifully pointed us towards in the beginning, and the idea that there is a written text, but also clearly that this information has been passed down and down because of this amazing experience that Gilgamesh had. That's why we have this, because of the hardships. The translation I was reading is because of the hardships that he has. So, yeah. So thank you so much, Jackie. I just want to say thank you so much for helping us make these connections. I know we really had quite a broad discussion, beginning with really his search for immortality. We talked about the friendships between the two. We talked about framing and poetics. So I really appreciate your intellectual generosity, sharing your thoughts on all these topics, and just being open for a very informal discussion like this. It really takes a very kind and generous spirit, and we really do appreciate that.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Yeah, I want to thank all our community members who joined us here, sort of in Hollywood Squares. I want to thank everybody who listened and watched live, and this will be available as a recorded dialogue, so I know many people will be watching it after the fact. Please check out the Hour 25 website, where you will find additional information. We're going to share links to other materials that Jackie has shared with us, things that were mentioned during this talk, and other things as well. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks for our next open house discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.